Arizona has declared a state of emergency due to alleged illegal border crossings into the U.S. The governor has reportedly called in the National Guard, signaling that Border Patrol and local officials are overwhelmed. For weeks, rumors had swirled in whispers among border agents and local residents of Nogales, Arizona. Strange movements were detected underground. Sensor triggers went off without explanation. Surveillance drones captured heat signatures where there should have been none. On a scorching July morning, the reality finally surfaced, both literally and metaphorically. U.S. authorities allegedly executed an immediate and total shutdown of a key portion of the Arizona border after uncovering what officials described internally as a massive, sophisticated underground tunnel system. What began as routine surveillance along the U.S.-Mexico border erupted into one of the most terrifying and tactically complex discoveries in recent history. The closure was swift and unyielding. Border checkpoints, once humming with traffic, ground to an abrupt halt. National Guard vehicles rumbled across access roads, blocking key entry points and sealing off entire sections of the border. Law enforcement erected makeshift perimeters, while military-style tents sprang up like mushrooms in the desert heat. To outsiders, it looked like a state of siege, and in many ways, it was. The discovery that triggered this lockdown wasn't just another tunnel. This wasn't a crude passageway used by desperate migrants or low-level traffickers. This was a labyrinthine structure, complete with ventilation systems, lighting, and rail tracks stretching miles long and buried deep beneath the Earth's crust. The tunnel connected multiple exit and entry points, some cleverly camouflaged within abandoned buildings, and others venting beneath natural rock formations. It was a marvel of clandestine engineering and a glaring vulnerability in national security that the government could no longer ignore. Satellite surveillance had initially detected unusual topographic shifts in an otherwise stable region. What followed was a carefully orchestrated subterranean probe spearheaded by a coalition of federal and state agencies. As investigators descended into the dark, a chilling revelation began to emerge. The tunnel was not merely a conduit for smuggling. It was part of a broader, coordinated infrastructure built with logistical precision. There were break rooms, storage areas, and even evidence of real-time communication devices. Whoever built this did so with professional expertise and near-limitless resources. The implications of such a find are seismic. A tunnel of this caliber is more than a breach of physical borders. It's a rupture in the integrity of national defense. The Arizona desert, long a symbol of rugged independence and unforgiving landscape, had concealed within its cracked skin a threat that no wall or drone could have anticipated. The shutdown wasn't just about plugging a hole, it was about recalibrating the very philosophy of border security. For years, U.S. border enforcement strategies have leaned heavily on visible deterrence, fencing, armed patrols, infrared sensors. But this find demonstrated something far more sinister. Adversaries no longer operate solely above ground. The enemy is beneath, unseen, and calculating. The tunnel's discovery exposed how reliance on traditional surveillance might lull authorities into a false sense of control, all while a silent network snakes through the desert below. The location added another layer of complexity. Arizona, particularly the corridor between Nogales and Tucson, has always been a high-stakes chessboard in the geopolitical tension between enforcement and evasion. But the tunnel's alignment suggested strategic intent. It intersected areas where legal commerce, immigration services, and civilian transit overlapped, areas not heavily scrutinized because of their routine appearance. This meant the people behind the operation knew not just how to dig, but where to dig. The structure was fortified against detection. Instead of the usual loose soil and haphazard reinforcement, this tunnel employed advanced materials, composite walls, anti-resonance linings to block sonar scans, and pressure-sensitive floor tiling that minimized heat signatures from human movement. It was a design straight out of a military manual, adapted for covert transit and survival in an environment hostile both above and below ground. What truly disturbed officials wasn't just the tunnel's existence, it was what they found inside. Within storage nooks along the tunnel walls were crates sealed in vacuum packaging. The contents included high-grade weaponry, encrypted electronics, and forged documents with multilingual coding. One cache held what appeared to be biometric spoofing kits, devices used to fool fingerprint and retina scanners. This wasn't smuggling. This was alleged infiltration. There was also evidence that the tunnel had been in use for months, possibly years, without detection. Worn treads in the flooring suggested frequent heavy transport far beyond what would be needed for moving people alone. Authorities speculated that machinery or large cargo was shuttled regularly between points. The implications raised uncomfortable questions. What had already passed through, and to where? The complete shutdown of the Arizona border segment was as much a logistical challenge as it was a symbolic gesture. Within hours of the discovery, border crossings turned chaotic. Commercial trade halted, and local businesses braced for economic whiplash. Interstate transport rerouted through distant corridors, creating bottlenecks and drawing public attention to a crisis that, until now, had been buried both literally and figuratively. Officials remained tight-lipped about the exact length and origin of the tunnel, but sources close to the investigation indicated that it spanned at least 6 miles across the border and dipped under multiple security zones. The engineering marvel baffled analysts who compared it to Cold War-era escape tunnels in Berlin, only more advanced. This was not the work of amateurs or isolated groups. It was systemic, coordinated, and likely state-funded or operated by transnational syndicates with military-level support. To make matters worse, the terrain above the tunnel was deceptive. Sparse, uninhabited brushland, dotted with dry creek beds, and the occasional wildlife sanctuary, areas considered low risk by surveillance standards. Areas where routine flyovers spotted nothing but dust and shrubs. It was in this visual quietness that the tunnel thrived. The desert stillness masked its most dangerous secret. As forensic teams descended into the tunnel with ground-penetrating radar and robotic probes, they began to map out a network more intricate than anyone had prepared for. The walls bore markings, some coded, some symbolic, indicating routes, hazards, and perhaps ownership. Power was drawn from solar panels, hidden in nearby ruins. Communication hubs relayed signals in short, encrypted bursts, presumably to avoid detection by standard frequency scanners. The presence of these technological nodes proved that those who built the tunnel were not just digging. They were planning for endurance, scale, and silence. What was discovered was no accident. It was a cross-border artery designed for continued use, fully aware of the nation's blind spots and prepared to exploit them with surgical precision. This raised an urgent philosophical dilemma within Homeland Security circles. How does one defend against threats that bypass the visible world entirely? How does one secure a nation from underneath. These weren't just tunnels, they were psychological weapons. They shifted the battleground from fences to fault lines, from towers to tunnels, from deterrence to deception. The shutdown sent shockwaves across state lines. Other border states scrambled to reassess their own vulnerabilities. Emergency meetings convened in hushed chambers, and maps were redrawn with new threat zones. The Department of Defense initiated consultations with geologists and underground warfare experts. An entirely new theater of border security had emerged, one that required a fundamental rethinking of policy, technology, and even imagination. Meanwhile, the communities near the sealed border watched in tense silence. Residents of Nogales and neighboring towns stood on the fringes of military perimeters, watching their everyday lives transform into a live-action tactical operation. Drones hovered, helicopters circled, and agents patrolled with canines trained not just for narcotics, but for underground scent trails. It felt less like a border town and more like a war zone. The discovery didn't just change how security agencies viewed the border. It changed what they feared. If such a tunnel could exist beneath Arizona, what else lay undiscovered in the vast, unmonitored stretches of terrain across the southern United States? What operations were still running, silently threading through soil and stone? There were early signs that this wasn't a one-off. Intelligence chatter indicated the presence of other black routes, terminology used to describe undocumented transit corridors, often known only to high-tier operatives. While some may be decoys, others could be functioning conduits ready to activate if one segment is compromised. The shutdown was not only a reaction to a terrifying discovery, but a preemptive strike against a potentially wider network. Every foot of the tunnel posed new mysteries. At certain intervals, the ceiling had been reinforced with blast-resistant material, suggesting preparations for possible raids. Elsewhere, decoy branches led to dead ends filled with empty crates and discarded tools. Misdirection aimed to confuse intruders. It was an architectural cat-and-mouse game, with one side always 3 steps ahead. Psychological operations experts began analyzing the tunnel not just as a structure, but as a message. Its complexity, concealment, and success in remaining hidden for so long pointed to a deeper narrative. Border security, as traditionally conceived, is no longer sufficient. The enemy had adapted, evolved, and gone dark, literally. The implications stretched beyond Arizona. Washington reeled under the weight of intelligence briefings that hinted at systemic failure. Surveillance tools had missed this. Intercepted communications had overlooked it. Field agents had walked above it. And all the while, the tunnel had grown, breathed, and operated with surgical stealth. The cost of ignorance is now being measured not just in resources, but in potential national exposure. The tunnel was not merely a pathway. It was a question mark carved into the earth, asking how a superpower could miss such a threat brewing beneath its feet. As the Arizona border remained under lockdown, attention shifted rapidly to the broader implications of such an audacious underground breach. The immediate threat had been contained, but the scale and sophistication of the tunnel exposed deep systemic vulnerabilities, ones that couldn't be patched with barbed wire or boots on the ground. In truth, this event forced a fundamental reckoning. The United States, for all its technological prowess and security apparatus, had underestimated not just the enemy's ingenuity, but the evolving nature of threats in the modern era. The tunnel unearthed a silent war that had been underway for years. It wasn't fought with drones or missiles, but with drills, deception, and data. Engineers behind the operation likely had access to geological surveys, satellite images, and municipal infrastructure blueprints. They weren't digging blindly. They were choreographing an invasion beneath the radar, using science and subterfuge as weapons. This wasn't guerrilla improvisation. It was methodical execution. Security experts now had to confront a bitter truth. While public policy had obsessed over walls and barriers, the real battlefield had shifted beneath their feet. With aerial and land surveillance dominating enforcement budgets, subterranean activity had been relegated to the margins of concern. Seismic sensors and tunnel detection technology, though in existence, were outdated or sparsely deployed across vulnerable regions. The tunnel's existence revealed how those tasked with border security had been outpaced not by superior firepower, but by superior foresight. The sheer audacity of the tunnel's infrastructure stunned even seasoned intelligence veterans. Along its length were modular compartments that appeared to serve specialized roles. One section bore the distinct characteristics of a processing zone: foldable desks, biometric scanning kits, and voice-encrypted tablets. This wasn't just a transit hub. It was an operational nexus, perhaps even a decision-making command point within the structure. Another disturbing revelation came when infrared scanners identified biological residue, evidence of animals being used to test movement through the tunnel undetected. It seemed that every conceivable scenario had been rehearsed. Agents discovered what looked like cages and padded tracks, suggesting controlled testing environments. The tunnel's planners had not only accounted for human transport, but had likely used animals to evade thermal and scent detection during test runs, an ingenious method to avoid triggering alarms. Further down the tunnel, agents found a climate-controlled chamber. It was small, but had its own power source and air filtration system. The presence of preserved food, hydration supplies, and medical equipment suggested it may have served as a refuge or holding area for high-value assets or individuals during transit. This level of detailed planning for emergencies within the tunnel revealed a mindset of longevity and strategic patience. This wasn't just an exit route. It was a living system designed for resilience. By now, the strategic intelligence community was operating at full throttle. Every clue from the site became a thread in a vast web of analysis. Linguists deciphered coded markings on tunnel beams. Data scientists worked to reconstruct digital blueprints from partially recovered memory devices. Experts in structural engineering reverse engineered the construction sequence, trying to determine where and how the operation started, and more importantly, who had the technical ability to pull it off without detection. Even more chilling was the lack of noise in the intelligence landscape. Usually, such a large undertaking would create chatter, transactions, supply chain anomalies, or local disturbances. But this time, there was nothing. Silence, total and deliberate. The entire endeavor had been wrapped in an operational shroud. It was now believed that small, compartmentalized teams were used to maintain secrecy, with individual units aware of only a portion of the plan. This level of compartmentalization is a hallmark of intelligence operations, not criminal enterprises. As forensic geologists began mapping the strata surrounding the tunnel, they discovered borehole residue dating back nearly a decade. In some places, Mineral deposits had reformed over abandoned shaft ends, a sign that initial scouting operations may have begun long before any tunnel was constructed. This wasn't a recent project. It was a long-term campaign, an operation that matured in silence and survived through layers of intentional concealment. Meanwhile, military analysts focused on the rail system embedded in parts of the tunnel. Constructed using non-reflective alloys and supported by shock-absorbing ties, the tracks bore none of the standard industrial markings. They had likely been custom fabricated, possibly in offshore facilities that specialized in untraceable logistics equipment. The rails suggested that carts or small vehicles had moved autonomously, possibly guided by magnetic sensors or onboard AI. There was no need for visible operators. The tunnel itself had become a machine. Beyond the tactical and structural revelations, the psychological fallout from the shutdown was spreading like wildfire. Local communities who once viewed the border as a symbol of protection now saw it as porous and fallible. Trust in federal security measures eroded quickly. The presence of armored vehicles and roving agents brought little comfort. Many felt they had been left vulnerable for years, while a ghost corridor grew beneath their homes and businesses. Schools in the surrounding counties initiated lockdown drills adapted to underground threat scenarios. Emergency response teams coordinated with geological consultants to develop contingency plans for tunnel collapses or gas leaks. Entire sectors of civil society were forced to prepare for dangers that had previously belonged in spy novels or war documentaries. Fear took root not in what was known, but in what had been missed. Back in Washington, the event triggered classified briefings at the highest levels of government. Congressional leaders demanded an urgent reassessment of Homeland Security funding allocations. Until now, tunnel defense had received a fraction of the attention paid to aerial and cyber threats. That imbalance, once theoretical, now had a face: an abandoned tunnel stretching across the desert like a silent accusation. Departments of Defense, Energy, and Homeland Security began collaborating in unprecedented ways. This wasn't just about border policy anymore. It was about infrastructure, national resilience, and asymmetric threat deterrence. Teams that normally focused on nuclear bunker monitoring and subterranean command centers were now reassigned to analyze civilian soil. Mining engineers from the private sector were summoned for consultations. A new interdisciplinary approach was born out of necessity, forged by the realization that America's enemies were no longer at the gates, they were beneath them. Perhaps the most troubling element of the tunnel's discovery was the lingering uncertainty about its purpose. While the presence of weapons, biometric tools, and transport infrastructure hinted at trafficking and espionage, the true objective remained elusive. Was it meant to smuggle agents? Was it a pipeline for sensitive data hidden from electromagnetic surveillance? Or, more ominously, was it designed as an access point for a future operation, one that had yet to be activated? Speculation ran rampant in intelligence circles. Some believed the tunnel was built to stage an eventual destabilizing event, such as a sabotage attack on a nearby energy grid or transport hub. Others theorized that it could serve as a command link to subterranean networks across the Southwest, an artery within a larger body of covert installations. With no official claims of responsibility and no intercepted communications to attribute ownership, every possibility remained on the table. The border remained sealed. Surveillance intensified not just above ground, but below. A new class of sensor technology was deployed, capable of reading deep Earth resonance shifts, heat anomalies, and electromagnetic fluctuations. Military-grade tunnel drones, originally developed for cave warfare in Afghanistan, were brought out of retirement and retrofitted for domestic application. Arizona had become a test bed for a new kind of countermeasure, one that married geology, AI, and national defense. Geopolitical tensions simmered. Neighboring nations demanded clarity, their governments eager to avoid implication, but equally interested in the tunnel's origin. Diplomatic lines burned with encrypted communications. Allies offered assistance, not just out of goodwill, but to protect their own flanks. If such a tunnel could be built into Arizona, who was to say one couldn't appear beneath the Pyrenees, the Alps, or the Great Wall? The world was watching nervously. The United States faced a brutal awakening. The terrain of conflict had changed. No longer confined to oceans, skies, or cyberspace, it now included the silent hollows of the Earth. The most advanced surveillance couldn't peer through rock. Satellites were useless against bedrock-bound threats. The challenge wasn't just one of detection, but one of philosophy. Security needed to be reimagined, integrating not just defense, but a new understanding of three-dimensional vulnerability. As construction experts surveyed similar geological regions across Texas, New Mexico, and California, they encountered anomalies, zones of unexplained compression, subtle shifts in underground water flow, faint traces of displaced sediment. These findings didn't confirm other tunnels, but they didn't rule them out either. A haunting possibility emerged. This tunnel might be the first discovered, not the first built. Educational institutions specializing in geology, engineering, and national security saw immediate increases in demand for courses related to subterranean detection, tunnel warfare, and asymmetric engineering threats. A new academic discipline was being born in real time, one that would bridge disciplines and train the next generation of specialists to defend against enemies who don't invade but infiltrate. The question of responsibility remained a black hole. Intelligence agencies combed through past surveillance tapes, intercepted emails, and border reports looking for breadcrumbs. Nothing definitive emerged. That level of operational silence could only be achieved through ironclad discipline or top-tier obfuscation, both of which narrowed the pool of suspects but failed to provide certainty. Whether it was a rogue cartel, a foreign intelligence entity, or a collaborative syndicate remained unknown. As days turned into weeks, the shutdown took on the weight of permanence. The land around the tunnel site became a no-go zone, cordoned off by fencing, floodlights, and 24-hour patrols. Heavy machinery arrived to excavate large sections of the surrounding desert. Engineers planned to fill the tunnel with high-density foam and reinforced concrete, a burial to ensure it could never be revived. But many doubted whether even such efforts could guarantee closure in a strategic sense. The tunnel may have been physically disabled, but the concept had been born, and with it, a new playbook for subversion. The shutdown echoed like a thunderclap across the country. No one was untouched. Politicians rewrote their platforms. Defense contractors accelerated the development of subsurface detection tools. Emergency response systems were updated to include subterranean threat protocols. The average citizen began to ask themselves not whether danger was coming, but where it was hiding. The ground had shifted, literally and symbolically. Arizona, once defined by its border skirmishes, now symbolized the future of unseen warfare, not with bullets and bombers, but with silence, shadows, and soil. The terrifying find beneath the desert had changed the game, and no one, no agency, no politician, no community, could afford to play by the old rules anymore. As the days dragged on under the intense desert sun, the shutdown held firm. Roads remained blocked. Patrol units kept cycling in shifts around the sealed sector, and a strange unease settled into the air. Journalists, unable to access the primary zone, camped at the edge of the perimeter, scouring for any scrap of detail they could intercept from passing officials or contractors. Drones were grounded in a wide radius, and even private aircraft were diverted miles away. Whatever had been discovered under Arizona wasn't just serious. It had become sacred ground for a national security reckoning. Inside the command compound established just outside the restricted zone, analysts worked around the clock to create a full three-dimensional model of the tunnel system. The structure's layout was input into an integrated simulation suite that allowed security architects to run breach scenarios, transport simulations, and even test hypothetical tunnel extensions based on surrounding soil density. With that data, a broader risk assessment began to unfold, not just about the existing tunnel, but about the surrounding terrain's potential to host others. This was not a job for the military alone anymore. Civil engineers, geotechnical scientists, architects, and even urban planners were brought in to create a comprehensive subsurface vulnerability map of the region. Not only were they looking for additional tunnels or shafts, they were identifying every underground cavity, natural fault, and artificial void within a 50-mile radius. The fear was no longer just what had been built, but what the land itself could hide or enable in the wrong hands. Meanwhile, an eerie pattern started to emerge when analysts overlaid timelines of cartel activity, trafficking spikes, and law enforcement slowdowns over the suspected periods the tunnel was active. The movement patterns, particularly in remote drop zones along the highway and in warehouses near Tucson, correlated strongly with operational clusters of the tunnel's suspected use. While it was impossible to definitively link specific crimes to tunnel activity, the pattern gave weight to the theory that a vast amount of illicit material, drugs, weapons, currency, had been moved undetected for years. For law enforcement veterans, the discovery shattered old assumptions. The existence of a tunnel, this complex meant that many so-called random disappearances of contraband or suspects might not have been random at all. It offered a hidden explanation for years of logistical anomalies, traffic surveillance dead ends, and failed stings. It was as if a ghost road had been uncovered, a parallel transportation realm that had, until now, outsmarted every strategy thrown at it. Yet, one of the most haunting implications came not from what was moved through the tunnel, but who. Analysis of fiber samples, clothing remnants, and biometric trace evidence hinted at the passage of individuals not listed in any known database of border crossings or federal watch lists. There were no fingerprints in international systems, no DNA matches, and no electronic identifiers. These phantoms, as they were dubbed by the intelligence teams, could have been anything. Operatives, mercenaries, spies, or experimental subjects in some greater criminal or state-level initiative. This opened the door to terrifying possibilities. If a covert organization had the ability to smuggle people so effectively that they left no trace, not even a digital footprint, it suggested